All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Hamblett, the Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute, and this afternoon's event, this conversation, I think is going to be one of the most interesting ones here of West. I'd like to thank our sponsor, again, Steampunk, for sponsoring the West Theater events here at West 2020. So this afternoon's conversation is based off of or follows a Naval Institute essay contest winner last year. I'm just going to make a shameless plug for Naval Institute essay contest. The General Prize essay contest every year is published in the May issue of Proceedings, and last year's winner was Hunter Stiers, the gentleman to my right, our left. And our essay contests date back, and particularly this one, the General Prize essay contest, dates back to the 1880s. And winners have included some prominent naval thinkers such as Alfred Thayer Mahan, Ernest J. King as a lieutenant in 1909, Lieutenant Commander Sandy Winnefeld, Senator Sam Stratton as a lieutenant commander, Lieutenant Stavridis, long before he rose to his prominent place. And our essay contests are judged in the blind, so they're a true meritocracy of ideas. We have about 12 essay contests every year. General Prize Essay Contest is just one of those. One we're going to start judging here when I get back to Annapolis will be the Emerging and Disruptive Technologies Essay Contest. So Hunter is the moderator for the panel this afternoon. He's a fellow with the John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the U.S. Naval War College. His area of inquiry centers on maritime strategy and logistics in the Western Pacific. Hunter is the most recent winner of the Naval Institute's General Prize Essay Contest. His winning entry, The South China Sea Needs a Coin Toss, was published last year in the May issue of Proceedings, alongside with a companion piece, Why We Defend Free Seas. And I would almost think that the Venn diagram between Hunter's writing and what Admiral Davison just said at the lunch address, the incredible overlap. And his related article, They Were Playing Chicken, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet's Gray Zone Deterrence Campaign Against Japan, 1937 to 1940, is featured in the summer 2019 issue of the Naval War College Review. He's a freelance contributor to the National Interest and a graduate of Columbia University. And so, Hunter, over to you with the panel, and good luck. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right. You're on, I think. All right.
Captain Hamblett.
Are you on?
Yeah, scoot towards you.
A little closer.
Captain. Yeah. Thank you. Podium?
There you go.
Captain Hamblett, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, and genuinely, thank you for making all of this possible. None of it would have happened without you. Thank you. I'd like to start by offering a brief setup for our conversation today. When we think about China in the South China Sea, we generally think of a few big things. We think of anti-Axis area denial capabilities. We think about the burgeoning conventional naval forces of the People's Liberation Army Navy. And of course, we talk about island building. Even though the building is done, the fortification is done, deployments have started, but we're still talking about the construction as if it's still going on. What we generally don't talk about is China's coercion of local civilian mariners in Southeast Asia. It's a subject that is deceptively mundane. Yet I would argue that this is in fact China's decisive line of effort in pursuit of an objective of truly world historical importance. China seeks nothing less than to undermine and ultimately overturn the rule of the prevailing regime of international law that upholds the freedom of the sea, a foundational U.S. national interest for which this country has gone to war no less than 6 times. This is what the Chinese are attacking. The Chinese understand that if you're having a fight over who governs. What you're really fighting about is whose laws are in force. And if you're fighting about whose laws are in force, then the decisive question in any such contest will, at the end of the day, be whose laws do the civilians follow? The Chinese are acting on this dynamic directly, and they are imposing their will on civilian maritime populations. We have a name for this. It's an insurgency. This one just so happens to be a maritime insurgency. And just as importantly, they are managing to do this without fighting. As we heard from Admiral Davidson at lunch, in this new era of great power competition, we here in the United States are devoting a lot of time and energy thinking about great and preparing for great power war. But the uncomfortable truth is that if we don't solve this problem, we won't need to worry about the big war. Because we will wake up one day and we will find that they have won and we have lost without so much as a shot fired in anger. Even without losing a big war, if we do not take action to stop China's maritime insurgency now, we will be living in China's world. So, to prevent this dark outcome, the United States, in conjunction with our partners and allies, must adopt a strategy of maritime counterinsurgency, positioning our forces to protect civilians as they exercise their rights under the free and open international legal regime that we seek to uphold. And that is what we are here to talk about today. And we have a phenomenal panel assembled for you this afternoon to get into the details of how we can move out in doing this. We have Dr. Steve Wills, top strategy analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. We have Captain Dan Straub, Ph.D., Division Chief for China on the Joint Staff J5. We have Captain Josh Taylor, who's the N51 Director of International Plans and Policy at the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And we have Bryan Clark, who has just taken up a new position as Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Congrats on the new gig. So, Dr. Wills, I'd like you to lead us off. And can you set the scene for us with some historical background, talk about the strategic imperatives that are at work here, and perhaps you can share some insight as to some case studies of past insurgencies, gray zone conflicts that we can use to inform our thinking as we seek to develop what maritime counterinsurgency should look like.
Thank you so much, Hunter. Appreciate that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll frame my my answer to Hunter's questions around three concepts: strategy, history, and a little bit of operations. So first on the strategy side, why is the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea doing this? And why are they competing for the world system? There are a lot of resources there, everything from fish to hydrocarbons. It's worth getting access to those if you can do that. The South China Sea itself is a good medium through which the PRC can influence or dominate, as needed, the other nations that touch that body of water. They do like to draw lines in the water. Finally, and sometimes overlooked, I think, is that the South China Sea is the terminal leg of a very long Chinese sea line of communication, from the Chinese coastal cities to their hydrocarbon suppliers in the Middle East, and the destination of their finished goods that they ship worldwide. China cannot yet control more of that long slock, as we call it, but it can control this terminal end. As Admiral Harry Harris once said, it's a great wall in the sand, but for what purpose? I would argue this purpose is to protect this terminal part of a very vital economic supply line for both supply and demand for the People's Republic. And the capabilities on those islands and what they're doing, as Hunter describes, is part of that effort. Okay, that's the strategy part. The history part. The South China Sea has been quiet largely for some time, other than a dust-up between China and Vietnam in the late 1970s that did involve some naval combat. But this was not always the case. As Hunter described in his article regarding the Asiatic Fleet in the Naval War College Review, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet engaged in some of the same kind of counterinsurgency or gray zone operations in the days leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War. The Asiatic Fleet had to compete with an aggressive Japanese invasion of China, while at the same time, while not at war, protecting U.S. and European economic interests in Shanghai. Asiatic Fleet Commander Admiral Harry Yarnell went as far as to deploy his flagship, a heavy cruiser USS Augusta, into the middle of Shanghai Harbor in the middle of the conflict, essentially daring the Japanese to drop a bomb on him and start a war. That's the level of counterinsurgency or gray zone effort that he went to. The Japanese ultimately attained their objectives. They took Shanghai, but they had to go to a world war to do it with obvious negative results. But for the period of the lead up to the Second World War, Western powers were not driven out of Shanghai, yet remained until the outbreak of war, hinting that Admiral Yarnell's general strategy was to a degree successful. Okay. How do we apply this to today's operations? How do the U.S. and its friends and allies operate in the South China Sea and not cede that space? As that means what you have to do is be in a competitive zone with the PRC as they attempt to protect their SLOC. Admiral Yarnell lacked capacity, and that was a challenge. He had one heavy cruiser and a few destroyers at his disposal. We need to have a much larger, distributive, small unit force in that region where it can compete on a day-to-day basis, where it can support U.S. allies and partners through exercises, through protecting fishing, through environmental concerns, through a whole host of mediums that together constitute a means of thwarting the Chinese effort to control this vital sea line of communication. And some of my colleagues are going to talk about the various force structures that we might employ to do that. In conclusion, the South China Sea is one of the focal points of great power competition, as has been hinted at, throughout this event. And the prize, as somebody told me once, is essentially control of the international system, as Hunter indicated here. The maritime trade and communications network that the United States has sort of been one of the primary defenders of since 1945 is potentially under threat. If you've been to sea at any point, you know that English is the lingua franca of bridge-to-bridge Channel 16 when you communicate in the maritime environment. This is a system we've built and nurtured and is at the foundation of much of our economic success. And we cannot afford to not compete effectively with the Chinese in this system. There's no other liberal democratic power waiting in the wings to pick up the pieces if we drop out, as was the case when we picked it up from the British at the end of the Second World War. We must therefore compete with the Chinese in this zone, and I look forward to hearing my other colleagues tell us how we're going to do that. Thank you.
Let's try this mic up. Is this working? No?
You want
Back
mine?
up here.
Okay.
So.
I give you mine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wills. That was really, really insightful. Thank you. Captain Straub, your role as Division Chief for China on the Joint Staff J5 gives you a terrific vantage point into how maritime counterinsurgency can fit into the larger strategic picture. Could you give us a view from Washington as to how Maritime Coin aligns with our grand strategic documents like the National Security Strategy, the National Military Strategy, and the Global Campaign Plan for China?
Absolutely, Hunter. Thank you very much. Thanks, Steve. Good comments. First, I want to make it clear that the views I expressed today are my own, not necessarily reflective of the Navy, the Joint Staff, or the government. Now, I do work on the Joint Staff, so I'm going to bring a lot of those experiences into the things I have today. What I want to start with, though, what are all the disparate problems that we're dealing with on a daily basis? Not just the problems, but when I say problems, I mean the things we need to work through to get to what this strategy means and how we develop this strategy. So most of you in the room know when we look at developing a strategy, we look at ends, we look at ways, we look at means, we look at assumptions, we look at risk. All those things have to go into the development of those documents from the start. So when we look at the national security strategy, it has to draw a straight line down through the national defense strategy, through the national military strategy, and then we have to develop our global campaign plans, and then it goes into those COCOM theater campaign plans and those plans. Now, in that global campaign plan that we're working on for China, and of which there are 5, as we know, global campaign plan for Iran, global campaign plan for North Korea, global campaign plan for Russia, global campaign plan for China, and then violent extremist organizations. Well, specifically, the global campaign plan for China incorporates all those things I said earlier. But we have to take into consideration this idea of competition. We're not, I mean, we may hear the word adversary, but we're also competing and cooperating where our interests align. But what really does competition mean? And if I went around the room and asked every single person, what does competition mean? What is great power competition? I'm sure you'd come up with some ideas on what competition means. Well, when I read Hunter's piece, you know, the thing I had to ask myself, and I know kind of where he led to, was, is our policy in the South China Sea working? Well, some of you might say no. Some of you might say sort of. But here's what I can say. I've been on the Joint Staff for a little over a year and a half, and I know that we have begun to routinize those freedom of navigation operations. We've begun to routinize getting ships out there and about, plying the seas in the South China Sea. We've been out there making it known. I know because we regularly get demarched on our activities in the South China Sea from the Chinese. They explain to us that that territory is undisputed Chinese territory. And while sitting in the room right across from the Chinese, when they say it's undisputed Chinese territory, the only answer I can give them is, we wouldn't be sitting here if it was undisputed Chinese territory. So the thing that we're competing with is something that doesn't necessarily align with what we understand the international order looks like. The international order that the Chinese want to see is oftentimes termed with Chinese characteristics. So that international order favors one country, and that's the Chinese. That's the PLA, and that's the PLAN, and their maritime militia. So I'm going to talk about, again, a number of the problems and just sort of stir the pot so that we get some really good questions that I'm looking forward to answering. Do we have the political will to pull off a counterinsurgency strategy in the South China Sea? Because if we start putting all our smaller ships, smaller vessels out there, boats, Mark 6s, etc., what if something happens? We all know the concept of a strategic rifleman. An incident occurs that leads us to war. One single shot's fired, a mistake is made. Now, there was a Naval War College review article that talks about that rarely happens at sea. When an incident occurs at sea, it usually ships break away, things get sorted out. But at the end of the day, the maritime militia is out there, and they're an ambiguous force. They're not recognized as one of China's 3 sea services. So how are we really going to deal with them? Are we going to shoulder them? What does that lead to? I mean, we've seen China use economic coercion against those smaller countries in different ways. I can think of at least 9 different examples of China using economic coercion, and of those 9 examples, only one went to the World Trade Organization where the Japanese won. It was when the Japanese, there was a collision with a Chinese fishing vessel. The Japanese arrested the captain, and the next thing you know, the Chinese decided, we're not going to give you any more rare earths. And it affected Japan's economy quite significantly because they used those rare earths to make a lot of electronics. Now, in 2010, a Chinese foreign minister, I believe, made the comment, you are all just small countries, and China is a big country, and that is just a fact. Now, readers of Thucydides, what does that sound like? The strong do what they will, the weak do what they must. So I look at those things, and we do this on the Joint Staff. We look at all these things taken in their entirety. How do we compete, knowing that the Chinese believe that that's undisputed Chinese territory? We also know that the Chinese are very, very sensitive to 5 different things called the 5 poisons. Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Chinese democracy movement, and Falun Gong. But they call them the 5 poisons. But we're seeing that any support or showing of support toward any independence in those cases, Taiwan specifically, or Tibet, or those sorts of things, raises a lot of ire from the Chinese, increasingly so. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is, I think our strategy in the South China Sea is starting to work, and in the last year and a half, if nothing, it has maintained a status quo that we need to continue to pressurize and continue to make it very clear that we're going to continue to send ships over there, conduct FONOPs, freedom of navigation operations. Our allies and partners are appreciative of the fact that we do these freedom of navigation operations because they themselves can't necessarily do them because they know that there's some form of economic or diplomatic coercion will cause them national pain in one way or another. So when we say we want to do this counterinsurgency strategy, we have to be very careful of what that looks like, what that means, and then how we actually put it into our strategic documents. So if we were to put it into our strategic documents, it would be in the form of intermediate military objectives, things that we say, all right, we can now assess that we've accomplished this one thing. Has China changed their behavior? Well, I would argue that China actually has changed their behavior a little bit in the form of not militarizing as heavily as they had been in the past. Also, by them starting to recognize that we're not going to stop doing these freedom of navigation operations. If we do stop doing freedom of navigation operations, not only will the Chinese believe that they have free reign of their 9-dash line and that it is undisputed Chinese territory, but as we know, it could possibly morph into customary international law. And then what does that mean for the countries who do actually have claims in the South China Sea or East China Sea? Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan. Those countries rely on the United States to conduct these freedom of navigation operations to make sure their claims aren't necessarily violated. They are, but I think a lot less so because we're there. As I mentioned, I have a good deal of things here to talk about, and I look forward to some questions. But I think the bottom line for us is we need to continue to strengthen our allies and partners, continue to share information, continue to make sure we're interoperable, work with our Five Eyes to develop those partnerships, exercise together, just like Admiral Davidson said, so that we can use those things, and then start encouraging our allies and partners, having their backs when they choose to conduct their own freedom of navigation operations, or maybe partner up with us in conduct of one or those sorts of things. I think I'll finish with enhancing our capabilities and coordination with those allies and partners, which is our center of gravity, is absolutely key to continuing to keep the Chinese or to continue to have the Chinese understand that the international order is not one with Chinese characteristics, but one that benefits all the nations, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world. Thanks.
Captain Straub, thank you for that, and a great segue into Captain Taylor's remarks. Captain Taylor, as the Director of International Plans and Policy for the Pacific Fleet, is on the front line of our security cooperation relationships with our partners and allies in the region. So, Captain Taylor, could you tell us more about those current security cooperation efforts, how we might use maritime counterinsurgency as a framework to guide those efforts, and what might need to change if we're going to make a serious move in this direction? Are there additional resources that you need, policies, priorities, legal authorities that need to be updated? Take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Hunter, and thanks for the setup, Dan. So as this is going to play out, we're kind of starting with the historical, maybe academic background. We've got the strategic view. I'm really going to focus my remarks on the operational perspective. Before we can have an informed decision about what could be done, which will be largely conjecture on my part and in no way official Pacific Fleet stance, I can represent, and I do want to bring everybody up to speed with what the Pacific Fleet is actually doing in this area with our allies and partners. So the bottom line is, how are we currently competing? We're having this conversation about how we could or should change to do something different. We need to understand and appreciate what we're doing now. So currently we're competing, and I would describe it as taking an economy of force approach. For the past 20 years, we have been, Indo-Pacific, although the NDS identifies us as the priority theater. The fact is that we've been fighting multiple conflicts in the Middle East, and for obvious reasons, CENTCOM, NAVCENT has demanded the majority of resources. So by taking this economy of force approach, we've really been trying to enable our allies and partners through theater security cooperation, operations activities, and investments, essentially to look after their own EEZs and defend their claims on the open seas. So starting with investments, there are two programs of note for building partner capacity, specifically the Maritime Security Initiative that Congress approved in 2016, which is blending more and more with what's known as the 333 Authority to help us train and equip our allies and partners. These capabilities have really focused on increasing their maritime domain awareness. The idea is that if they know what's going on in their EEZs and out on the high seas, they will be able to sense, share, and contribute to a regional approach. Specific programs such as Sea Vision, which is a web-based AIS maritime domain awareness tool, have been very successful. We've also transferred tactical UAVs such as Scan Eagle, and also funded some maritime patrol aircraft modifications. So it's important to help our allies and partners invest in basic technologies, because individually, no individual regional country has the capacity to stand up to the PLAN, the Coast Guard, or the Maritime Militia. So just basic capacity to do so, they need help with. So the second line of effort, I would say, is our activities. And those really break down to exercises, subject matter expert exchanges, and training. Two programs of note that I'd point out that have been very successful have been our CARAT, our Cooperative Afloat Readiness and Training Program, which is a bilateral program we have with 10 regional nations. And additionally, more and more, the CCAT exercise, Southeast Asia Cooperation Afloat Training, is becoming really the flagship South China Sea training event. What's notable about this is not only is it multinational, it's multi-agent, it's interagency. So not only do regional navies participate, but also regional coast guards. And it's important to note that just as the Chinese are exploiting those seams between what is military, what is civil, what is law enforcement, in our countering of their efforts, we need to be similarly agile. So moving on to operation, and additional key activity is, of course, information sharing on a case-by-case basis. This can be a critical enabler of partner action, as pointed out by Admiral Davidson. Timely notification of the Indonesians in January allowed them to take welcomely bold action off of Natuna in defense of their EEZs and the Chinese fishing fleet's encroachment. So the final line of effort is operations, and as has been pointed out, the freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, are really PAC Fleet's flagship program in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So as has been pointed out, we are not, in fact, signatories of UNCLOS. We follow UNCLOS as a matter of customary international law, which means if we don't enforce the custom of innocent passage and transit of those areas that are illegitimately claimed as national Chinese waters, if you don't defend it, over time it will become the custom that it is, in fact, China's. So it's vitally important that we continue the FONOPS program, and of course we are encouraging our allies and partners to engage in their own FONOPs as resources and national policy allow, but we are also welcoming them to join with us to do combined freedom of navigation operations. And of course, presence. I don't think anybody can argue the fact that persistent, or I would say periodic U.S. presence has prevented the Chinese from taking more overt military actions. And really, if you look at, this is going a little bit more towards the dime fill, or the strategy, this is really a dime fill problem. So for those of you, anybody don't know what dime fill is? Okay, so when we talk national strategy, we talk about the instruments of national power. So you have the diplomatic, information, military, economic, and then some people like to add on financial, intelligence, and legal. Okay, so in any of these problems, especially wicked problems as they call them, you really have to hit on each of these pillars. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're moving forward in a coherent manner across all these across all these pillars. So then the question is, so that is to say, there's a limit to what the M pillar can do in and of itself. And I would maintain that the U.S. Navy's #1 military job is to prevent China's recourse to overt high-end military action. And I think unambiguously we've been successful in doing that so far. The conundrum that we face in the South China Sea is if we're successful at preventing the big M, as I call it, well, they go to the little m. And that's when you get into the salami slicing and the competition short of armed conflict. And what do we do about that? So FONOPs are great, and they're a necessary component of a strategy to counter the Chinese actions. However, in and of themselves, personal opinion, I don't think they're enough. So this is where we're transitioning from what PAC Fleet is doing to Captain Taylor's good idea about what could be done, as the hypothetical. So, there is a body of research that shows what works. CSIS did a study in July of 2018, countering the gray zone, maritime gray zone, what works. So we know that transparency, naming and shaming of gray zone or insurgent action works. Keeping in mind that insurgency seeks to overthrow the existing rule set, whereas this gray zone activity is really a nation state using some of the, I would say, TTPs of an insurgency to enact their national will. So I would say two sides of the same coin, closely related. I may be conflating them a bit, so please forgive me. So transparency, name and shame, deterrence, and early and bold decisive action will get, traditionally has gotten gray zone actors, China and Russia, to back off of their activities. So how do we do this? So right now we have periodic high-end presence. What I would argue for is if we want to do this, if we all agree that, yeah, it's a maritime insurgency and we need to maritime counterinsurgency, what do we need? Well, we need what I call persistent low-end presence. And this is like the combined action teams in the Vietnam War. These are the beat cops that are there on a daily basis, because as good as FONOPs are, we're only there part of the time, and when we go away, the maritime militia is still there, the Chinese Coast Guard is still there, and those are the folks that the oil companies, those are the folks that the fishermen in particular, who, by the way, have significant political power in the regional countries, they have to deal with these folks. So what would this persistent low-end presence look like? Well, I'm not going to, I think some other people are going to make some remarks to what a future force could be like, but I need to constrain my ideas to what we have now. So what it looks like to me is a combination of small boats, so Mark 6s that we already have, PCs, operating in the EZs outside of 12 nautical miles, supported by ESVs, so those are expeditionary float bases, and potentially LCS, and tactical UAVs as a stand-in contact layer force to observe, report, reassure, and provide logistics and ISR support to willing allies and partners. And those allies and partners would either be high-end, such as Japan or Australia, or perhaps out-of-area high-end partners. But also, I'm kind of taking the approach, build it and they will come. Each of the individual countries have an interest in opposing China's bad actions. However, you risk the first mover problem. The first one to stand up is going to get whacked, and everybody else is going to, so who's going to go first? So if we're out there and we lead the way, I suspect that we will coalesce a regional response. Now, there are some additional out-of-the-box ideas, such as contractor-owned, government-owned assets with multinational crews, which would definitely make things a little bit more, the Chinese calculus a lot more difficult. Who are they dealing with? Under what legal regime? All right, kind of flip the script on the China's use of lawfare. As far as what we would need to get to this, now we have a lot of these assets, but they're tied up in the Middle East. So in my opinion, what we would need is from the very top in D.C., OSD and the Joint Staff, we would need some sort of execution order, perhaps a named operation, which would give us the legal authorities to do things like information sharing, give us legal authorities for funding, manning, and global force management prioritization. So with that, that's kind of my outline of where things are, where things could go. But again, this all comes down to what does National Command, sorry, I know it's an old term, but what does the National Command Authority want? Mm-hmm. How much do we value this current competition in the South China Sea? So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Captain Taylor. That was a really valuable way of kind of connecting, from that kind of political, grand strategic into the operational side. And I think that a really great segue into what I think Mr. Clark is going to be ready to talk about as, renowned expert in terms of how we need to be thinking about, operating in the future and managing in gray zone environments and kinetic confrontations. So a couple of questions, since, I think the conversation is kind of brought out some themes in terms of, so we're going to be dealing, if we're pushing forces forward, we're going to be dealing with a situation where the PLA will have local military superiority and therefore escalation advantage. How do you deal with that? Another component, how do you potentially integrate military, paramilitary, civilian forces of U.S. and partner countries? And then new technologies. Are there what kinds of technologies in terms of electronic warfare, space, cyber, the fun stuff that we like to talk about here at West? What role do they have to play? So, Mr. Clark, take it away.
Oh, well, thanks, Hunter. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I'm not the expert on the South China Sea, but I will harvest all the good ideas that came from these guys and then make them my own, like a good think tanker. One thing I'm taking away from this conversation, as we know from our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, is the target audience for our actions is the local population. So in this case, the target audience are the South China Sea nations, as you guys have been saying. It's not the Chinese. The Chinese have a set of objectives they want to pursue. We need to convince the Southeast Asian allies and partners that we're there for them and that we will be able to be there for them. And as you mentioned, the challenge with that today is our deterrence is not credible. So right now, the long-range weapons, the wide area sensors the Chinese have in the Western Pacific, the A2AD problem, as we'd like to call it, provides them escalation advantage. They've got the ability to rain down precision weapons on large scales on any of our forces that are operating in that area. So either we have to roll in with a force package that's big enough to defend itself, which might be perceived as being overly aggressive and disproportionate to the gray zone activities that are occurring, or we go in there kind of alone and unafraid, like we talked about this morning, with the Pacific Fleet use of Coast Guard ships. So those ships are not going to defend themselves very effectively against a long-range set of Chinese anti-ship missiles that come in from an island or from the mainland. But that's a proportional force we could use to try to push back on gray zone aggression by the Chinese. So kind of a fundamental problem we need to address is how do we make our forces able to counter this escalation advantage? So our forces, when they go in, need to be able to operate proportionally and not appear to be overly provocative. And at the same time, they need to be credibly able to defend themselves so that our partners and allies in the Southeast Asian nations see that we can be there for them and we can credibly defend their interests. Because really, it's their dog. Their dog is in the fight, and we can't go in there and counter the Chinese unless we do it on behalf of these countries. So that's why they're the target audience. So some ways that we've talked about doing that are fundamentally, you've got to increase the complexity or size of an attack that the Chinese would need to mount in order to defeat your little proportional force. Which means, how do I better defend my forces? The traditional approach is let's put a lot more VLS-mounted interceptors on these ships and make them able to shoot down a bunch of incoming weapons. Well, that would mean a big ship that now you've kind of blown out the proportional part of that equation. So we need to think about things like electronic warfare, directed energy as ways to defend ships against precision weapons attack. And also counter-ISR capabilities that will make it harder for them to be targeted, or decoys that would allow them to seem like a larger force. That also implies if you have more platforms, a more distributed force, you can increase the complexity and size of an attack that the Chinese may need to mount. So 5 small combatants like PCs or even Mark 6s would be not much more disproportionate than 1 DDG, or they probably would be less disproportionate. But they'd probably be a more challenging target set for the Chinese to deal with. So you're a more credible deterrent, you're a more credible benefit to your ally because you're able to defend yourself more effectively. The other part of this is how can I make my small proportional force able to deliver effects against Chinese forces without having to go big, without having to, escalate the fight to something highly kinetic. So again, directed energy, high power microwave, undersea capabilities that might be delivered covertly. Those might be ways to deliver effects against Chinese forces to send the message that we are there on behalf of our allies in the region without necessarily escalating the conflict beyond what is appropriate for a gray zone confrontation. There's some fleet design elements of that we talk about in the surface warfare study we just released, some copies of which are down there if anybody wants a copy, shamelessly plugging our product at CSBA that we have to then distribute for free. Then in terms of the paramilitary and military cooperation, what's interesting is coming out of that is that the Chinese have, of course, used the People's Maritime Militia, the Armed Maritime Militia, the Coast Guard, and the PLAN together to provide kind of a synergistic capability so that the paramilitaries can be the front end of that action, but they're backed up by the mainland-based precision strike weapons, as well as being backed up by the PLAN forces that are deployed at sea. We need to think about a similar approach. So instead of sending our Coast Guard ships to go interact with our allies in the region or the Chinese by themselves, we need to think about doing that in concert with U.S. naval forces so that they're able to provide that backup and that overwatch to defend that Coast Guard ship in the event that things escalate outside of the gray zone confrontation that's already in progress. A couple ideas there to add to that are there's some approaches we could think about doing for using unmanned vehicles and space systems to better monitor actions in the South China Sea, convey to the Chinese that we are observing them. This naming and shaming idea could be done from unmanned air systems, could be done from inexpensive or less expensive LEO-based satellite systems. As long as you're then able to convey that message to the Chinese by virtue of how you deploy your forces. So if they're doing something and you've got the ISR that allows you to monitor it, you can redeploy your forces in such a way that you can put them in the location of the confrontation and try to send the message to the Chinese that you're there, that you understand that they're trying to do something against one of their neighbors, and that we're going to be there to defend their interests. So I think kind of fundamentally we need to deal with this escalation problem that we're challenged with, because right now our responses to Chinese gray zone activity are basically either go big or go home. We need to have something in the middle of the escalation ladder. Those rungs are going to be given to us probably through a combination of less expensive, higher magazine capacity defenses, and electronic warfare directed energy systems. And then we also have to have this fleet that's able to distribute itself to a greater degree so it's able to provide that more complex targeting picture as well as interact with Chinese forces at the point of confrontation instead of having to respond after the fact. So the larger, more distributed fleet equipped with these new technologies might enable us to defeat this escalation dominance challenge that we are faced with and try to better impact the target audience's perception of U.S. credibility.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clark. That was a really, I think now getting into the operational thinking about, okay, how do we actually go out and deploy forces and do this? I'd like to open this up, this conversation up to the wider panel for a few minutes. Just really kind of go to. There are a lot of different facets of this question in terms of what kinds of forces should we be looking to deploy? What are the different roles of the different services? How do you sustain everything logistically? And then, continuing the political, diplomatic, and legal conversations. I know certainly in terms of small surface combatants, we have a very strong small surface combatant. The force is strong with this panel, in that Dr. Will served on PCs and minesweepers. Captain Straub is a former LCS and frigate commander. Captain Taylor with his advocacy of Mark VIs, and Mr. Clark with his advocacy of corvettes in several CSBA studies. So batteries released. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start with one thing about the larger capacity that we're all asking for here in terms of small surface combatants, unmanned systems, etc. It's going to require some sort of distributive logistics system to support that, both afloat and ashore. So that's something that industry can definitely help us out with, is how to figure out how to do that, because right now our logistics, like some of our other capabilities, is concentrated in a small number of larger ships. So keep in mind the logistics part as we talk about how to deploy that force and operate it.
So I think to build onto your comments, a critical piece in any of this is going to be the diplomacy that underpins it. Because as we see with the Philippines abrogating the VFA, they're making, Duterte is making statements that he wants to take a look at the Mutual Defense Treaty. This is a critical piece. Who's going to say yes to support us for the throughput of logistics? So right now, I think the relationship with the Philippines goes through peaks and valleys. We happen to be at a valley at the moment, but I think our relationship is strong and historic. But we need to keep that piece in mind, because unless we get the diplomatic access piece correct, we're going to be trying to do this replenishment at sea from distance, probably down from Japan, Singapore are the most likely locations. So, underpinning all this is the diplomatic piece, and what makes it challenging with the Philippines at the moment, or any of these countries, is we want to lead, and American leadership is indispensable in this problem set, but at the same time, we can't want it more than they do. So you have to balance the two.
I'd say, and there's a relationship between the small combatant discussion and the diplomatic discussion. One of the reasons why our partners in the region may not, want to respond to us diplomatically is because they're not convinced that we are going to be in it for the long haul. So they look at the capabilities we bring to bear. They see that if your force is designed around a relatively small number of large, expensive surface combatants, you can only be in so many places at once. They're really expensive to sustain and maintain deployed at sea. The Navy's had a lot of readiness challenges. They see what's deployed there on a day-to-day basis now, which is, something less than 10 surface combatants through the entire Western Pacific on any given day. Then they're questioning, okay, I make this diplomatic agreement with you, I allow you to bring more forces in, or we try to pursue that. Are you really going to be able to sustain any level of presence that's going to allow me to push back on Chinese efforts to take Scarborough Shoal, for example, if I'm the Philippines? So you got to be able to be there and be credible in the way that you're there. The other part of it is this escalation dominance problem, because if you look at the U.S. right now and you're the Philippines, you'd say the U.S.'s only way to counter the taking of Scarborough Shoal is to go big, is we are going to start a series of attacks against Chinese islands, we're going to attack the mainland. It turns into a big fight because the U.S. doesn't have any options below that level of escalation. We've got to try the shore-based and island-based weapon systems in order for our forces to be survivable. So the Philippines and others might see that as just not credible. Therefore, why would they get in bed with us? They're going to seek to bandwagon with the Chinese in an effort to protect their interests.
want to hear some questions.
Why don't we, at this point, let's open it up to questions from the audience. We've got a mic right here. Please, come right on up and ask a question. Our panelists will do the best to answer it as best they can.
Gentlemen, thanks. Commander Pat Funk. One of the questions, and again, experience indicates that history doesn't often repeat itself, but it certainly sounds a lot alike. As you discussed, and I think most of us agree completely that a low-end persistent presence is probably the best way to create a credible deterrent and facilitate that belief diplomatically that we're going to be there. One of the things that's concerning, obviously, is there is a risk of miscalculation. And I think that's one of the things that probably is the biggest fear we have. So, similar to the Cold War and the negotiation of the AFCEA agreement with the Soviet Union, which allowed us to prevent those miscalculations in the maritime domain from leading to something bigger. Is there anything afoot in that realm with the Chinese to do that, to allow that? And if not, what's different in your estimation?
Yeah, let me start off with that one. So, a few years ago, 3 to be exact, there was something called the Joint Staff Dialogue Mechanism. The Joint Staff Dialogue Mechanism was set up specifically by General Dunford so that we would have an INCSE-like agreement where if there was an incident, here are the connective lines of who to call, when to call, how to do it. That first meeting went extremely well. They started thinking of these confidence-building measures. They started discussing how we were going to get these crisis communications and risk reduction framework in place. That was going well. And then, in 2018, we put CATSA sanctions, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, on the Chinese for purchasing a Russian weapons system. When we did that, China's response was cancel the JSDM, which seems just strange to me because the one reason for the JSDM was to enable us to have a crisis communications network where we would be able to address these sorts of things. So the calculus that the Chinese use in some of these things is not the same as the calculus we use for these sorts of things. Bottom line is, we're still looking to create that crisis communications and risk reduction framework and get it in place, but it's not there. And in fact, if there's an incident with the Chinese, the call would come from our government to OIMC, the Office of International Military Cooperation. They don't answer the phone. They then reach out to the CMC if they take the message, and the CMC, Chinese Military Commission, they're the ones who have to make the decision on how they're going to deal with the situation. This is 24 to 48 hours after the fact. If you go back and look at the situation that happened with our the plane that ended up getting confiscated by the Chinese, that took a long time. And what ended up working? Old friendships between people who had met each other years earlier, not some sort of INCSE-like agreement like we have with the Russians. And General Dunford, I've been told that he has said, if something happens between us and the Russians, I can call up General Gerasimov and get it figured out right away. But we don't have anything like that with the Chinese. And to answer your question, we're really working to try and get something where we can talk and communicate at a level that would reduce those risks.
Hey, a quick historical point about INCSE as well. It's a mid-1970s agreement, but if you go on YouTube and look up USS Yorktown, USS Karen bumper drill ops in the Black Sea, the Russians are still behaving that way in the mid-1980s, very similar to what you've seen with Russian and Chinese warships coming close but not actually bumping U.S. ships in recent months in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a good framework, but incidents will continue, most likely.
So just a quick point, because I want to get onto this gentleman's question, but we do have an agreement in place through the Western Pacific Naval Symposium called CUES, the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which has been somewhat successful in reducing the incidence and seriousness of encounters at sea. The problem is that the maritime militia is not acknowledged as part of the Navy, so they don't have to adhere to it, and they don't. So
That's right.
Hi, I'm Sam LeGrone with USI News. How does political actions by actors such as the Philippines talking about getting rid of EDCA and the Visiting Forces Agreement and change the dynamic in the South China Sea? So, I mean, that was considered to be a reliable partner. And Admiral Davidson said earlier today that yes, we still have faith in the Philippine alliance, but it changes the dynamic a little bit, in the South China Sea, and how does that affect? And then, sort of as a corollary to that, sort of the growing relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam. So I think TR is going to be there sometime this week. I think might be pulling in tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about sort of maybe those sort of inter-ASEAN dynamics and how that could be shifting the picture a little bit in that region?
You guys want
I'll take a stab at this one. So as I said before, you can't want it more than they do, and there was after the tribunal's decision in 2016 about Scarborough Shoals, there was a primary window that if we were poised, that we could have enacted some sort of operation or concerted effort to stand shoulder to shoulder with our Philippine treaty allies. For various number of reasons that didn't happen. I would say chief amongst which is because President Duterte came out and said, I know everybody, with the decision went in our favor, but we're essentially not going to do anything about it. They're not going to try to enforce it. So when you have a treaty ally that won't stand up, for their rightful claims, their acknowledged claims, it's very difficult to make the political argument in D.C. that we should be out in front of them. So, yes, it is a challenge. From our perspective at PAC Fleet, we maintain the relationship with the Philippine Navy. They're a credible force, but whether it's an ally partner, just like the U.S. Navy, at a certain point, the politicians and our political leadership makes a decision, and we say aye, and we move out. So.
But also, I think it's and you're right, absolutely right. It's short-sighted on the part of the political leadership to not recognize that the Philippines might be, responding to the challenges and the stressors they have in their region. So they've got the Chinese putting a lot of pressure on them. They're responding to that by trying to keep them happy to some degree, recognizing that the U.S. is never going to turn their backs on the Philippines regardless of how they behave. So the U.S. should be continuing to provide the support and the protection and offer defense to the Philippines, even when it's not really accepted wholeheartedly as we've had in the past by the Philippines. I think Duterte's current actions may just be a negotiating ploy to try to get the United States to be a little bit more open to the Philippines government having some response or control over legal cases involving U.S. service members overseas. There's a dynamic going back and forth here that may have nothing to do with a desire to get the U.S. out of the Philippines. It may be all about negotiating better terms. It may be about signaling to the Chinese that they don't need to be more aggressive than they already are. But in the U.S. side, what we need to do is just continue being supporters of the Philippines and on our government side and our military side to ensure that the people and the government there know that we're with them and got their back, even if they don't really respond, wholeheartedly or encouragingly to that effort.
Good afternoon, sir. For you JROTCs, this is your battle, and you're going to be fighting it very, very soon. Let's go back to 1812.
It's you.
I believe we went to war over the navigations and merchants at that time.
Indeed.
So let's advance forward from that. Let's go back to the Liberty in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. Shot up by the Israelis, even though they knew it was an American ship and not spying for the Egyptians. Let's go back to the Pueblo, sitting off the coast of North Korea. When China decides it wants to quarantine Formosa, just like we quarantined Cuba, give me some idea on how you think the United States is going to act at this particular venue. If they decide they want to take over a Philippine ship of any size and they drag it away, where do you think we're going to be, even though we have a treaty with the Philippines to take and help defend them? Just like I said this morning over here, pie in the sky and a lot of dreams. Legally, it takes decades to get any of these things done. So that's where I'm going to leave the answer at for you all to take and share with me how we're going to take and accomplish protecting those nations which are on the China Sea. When they decide to move the 9-dash line out and say, this is our bay, this is our ocean, and I want to see what you're going to do about it now. And we're going to go through all the legalistic things. The UN is pointless, spineless. Many of our treaties are pointless and spineless. So there we go.
Thank you. John?
You all better be paying.
The big thing is just to be there. I mean, so if you're not going to be able to defend somebody's interest unless you're there, and you're there proximate to the point of that confrontation occurring. So that's why I think it's really important to have this force that's able to credibly defend itself and defend our allies' interests at the point of confrontation, so we're not having to respond after the fact, but we respond immediately when that seizure occurs. Yeah.
So what I can assure the gentleman is that there are planners at PAC Fleet and INDOPACOM looking at all the scenarios. We have contingency plans, but what you're talking about is political will. And that happens back in D.C., not in Hawaii.
Some years back, we had this unfortunate incident off Iran in disputed waters where an American small boat was surrounded by Iranian naval vessels, and our sailors chose to surrender rather than resist. Now, assuming with better training and better command and control, this would not happen again. But I'm thinking about our potential allies or other littoral nations, the Vietnamese, the Indonesians. To what extent do you think should we try to embolden them to resist with constant patrols by small boats, Chinese incursions? And is there a risk of something like this happening again, which of course would hand the Chinese a big propaganda victory and say, look, this is our territory, and as proof of that, the Indonesian cutter surrendered to us when we confronted it. How can we try to prevent that from happening, or should we rely on our allies? Should we only rely on our own forces?
Great question.
Yeah, I'm going to answer just a couple quick sentences, and then I'll turn it over to here. We just had a conversation about this, and one of the things America is not very good at right now is getting the messaging out at the speed of what we say called relevance, at the speed of relevance. So at the end of the day, we've got to message when their behavior is such that it's not in line with the international order. We have to make it very clear that they are going against the rest of the world, essentially, and that they're alone in it. We're not good at it right now because the Chinese are very good at messaging. They're very good at getting their message out there, and we have to learn how to get faster at getting that done. As far as responses go, I think we are intentionally ambiguous about how we will specifically respond, because we want to make it very clear that that we're not going to tell you what the red line is, because you might just push on it.
And this will be our last question here. Thank you.
Hello. So with the increasing U.S. companies and their vested interest in China's economy, and with the escalating trade war, with the potential of escalation in the South China Sea, what would it be the impact on, say, the U.S. economy and other interests that the U.S. may have?
Well, yeah. So certainly there would be an impact on the economy. I mean, you're seeing already, with the coronavirus and with the trade war, what a isolated China means to the world economy. And it's not good. And so the question is, are we willing to pay that cost in the interest of longer-term geopolitical stability and the credibility of U.S. deterrence? In the case of the trade war, the government, the administration's made that determination and said it's worth that cost. We would probably have to have a similar calculation here.
For the naval perspective, at least, all the way from Admiral Davidson down to what Captain Taylor was just speaking of, we need some sort of a joint operational plan that governs when we react, how we react, and with what forces do we react. And having that plan in place can help mitigate some of the potential crises that might evolve from what you just described in terms of trade issues.
Happy to talk after as well.
Thank you.
All right, I hate to cut this off. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank, on behalf of the Naval Institute and AFCEA International, our speakers, our panelists, for taking their time and sharing their insights today on what is a truly wicked problem. Right? This is one that touches on all aspects of national power, touches on our alliances and our partners, touches on military capabilities, and really impacts our way forward in the South China Sea and in the Asia Pacific over the next 5 to 10 years. So, Hunter, thank you for writing your award-winning essay. that we published last year. And I was so glad that we were able to turn that into a panel discussion that turned into such a good discussion today. For those of you in the audience, thanks for your questions. And before you leave today, please bring up the West app and fill in some of the the session survey before you leave. And on behalf of the Naval Institute and AFCEA, I want to give each of our panelists a copy of Professor Jim Holmes' new book, A Brief Guide to Maritime Strategy. Thank you again.